Grimdark meets cosmic horror and a cover that just won't quit. You better believe I read this book. Today, we're talking about Grave Empire by Richard Swan. Throughout this story, you see this empire of politics and heresy. There's something ancient and creepy underneath all of reality that you don't really know what it is, and multiple threads and multiple storylines are starting to converge on almost, I would say, a collapsing society. Some of the bigger themes in this book include colonialism, which seems to be a pretty popular theme right now in a lot of fantasy novels. Certainly, the idea of loss, human nature, power dynamics, the lust for power, and the existential dread that comes with not necessarily knowing or understanding your purpose, or once believing you knew what your purpose was, but all of that being called into question, which is, I think, one of the more interesting themes that is woven throughout the book. We have a few key characters that are pretty memorable. We have Renata, who's a civil official. We have Peter, who's a captain, and we have Colonel Glazier. We also have a lot of other secondary characters throughout, but those are kind of the three big narrative storylines that are woven throughout the story. Here's what worked for me. The immersion and world building are incredible. Richard Swan just knocked it out of the park. There's so many different elements that make this world feel so believable and grounded, yet still fantastical. And what this book does in such an incredible way is takes the genre of fantasy and takes the genre of horror and mushes it together into a beautiful, weird little baby. And I loved it. One of the other things that really worked for me is that there's this thematic lattice really throughout the entire narrative where you have all these big themes and they support the story rather than overshadow the story. And sometimes with books, particularly books that are talking about colonialism or power dynamics, it could get really heavy handed. And I thought Richard Swan does a really nuanced job of showing, not telling, but also inviting the reader to kind of examine how they view some of those bigger themes, which is always I'm just always going to be drawn to that more than when someone is just super heavy handed and preachy at me. There are a few things that didn't work for me personally that may not work for you as well. I don't know. While the primary characters were all very richly drawn and interesting, most of the side characters felt pretty uneventful to me. They didn't, I mean, they definitely had consequences in the story, but I just didn't really care about any of them. There's so much world building going on and so much kind of scene setting that those three characters really take the priority, and I think understandably so. But oftentimes a book can be let down when the secondary characters or some of the even the ones that only show up for a little bit, when they don't have meaningful narrative arcs, or they're not really bringing anything to the table other than suddenly you have another name you're trying to remember and then they're brought up again way later on in the book. Like those kinds of things just can kind of sometimes cause confusion for my brain. So that was one thing that didn't work for me. And the other thing that didn't work for me is that this book has really big book one energy. And by that, I mean it's very clear that this is book one. It is a lot of setup. It is a lot of like foundational, get the pieces in place, which again is not necessarily bad. I'm just always a fan of, even if it's a series, that each book should feel standalone, yet clearly is leading into the next story. And I think Richard Swan does that for the most part, but there's definitely like, it's just got that big book one energy, is the only way I know how to say it. Now, my determination always falls into one of three categories. Just read it. If you have time, read it. Or it's your time, not mine, so read it if you want. And this is definitely a just read it. It's almost on the border of if you have time or just read it. Like it's right on the cusp, but I think it's a worthy book to be read, particularly if you are a fan of fantasy or horror or both. I would say absolutely just read it. Like it's not even a question. If you're someone who's more of like, I'm not a big fan of horror, but I do like fantasy, or I'm a big fan of horror, but I'm not a big fan of fantasy, that's where I go, this is probably more of a, if you have time, just read it. Because I do think either way, you're going to enjoy it, and it's going to have enough themes, enough interest, enough gore and surprises that it's going to keep you engaged. All right, that's it. As always, stay curious, read deeply, and I'll see you in the library.